when kindness becomes a map to your death. There is a mathematics to generosity that most people never stop to calculate. Every time you help a stranger, every ride you offer, every smile you give without asking questions, you are not just being kind. You are giving away data, your routines, your habits, the hour you come home, the way you unlock your door, the fact that you live alone. Information accumulates quietly in other people's minds until one day someone decides they know enough. This story is about a young woman who believed kindness was harmless, who believed money meant protection, who believed living in a beautiful building in a glamorous city surrounded by people meant she was safe. She was wrong. In 1944, Los Angeles was swollen with uniforms. Soldiers on leave, men passing through for days, sometimes only hours, before being shipped overseas. The city pulsed with music, dance halls, wartime romance, and the illusion that danger belongs somewhere else. On distant battlefields, not behind apartment doors. And in the middle of it all was a 20-year-old oil heiress named Georgette Bauerdorf. She spent her evenings dancing with soldiers at the Hollywood Canteen, giving rides to hitchhiking servicemen, buying small luxuries for boys who might be dead within weeks. She became known for it. Warm, approachable, generous, beloved. And that reputation, the very thing that made her admired, also taught someone exactly when she came home, how she entered her building, and that she lived alone in an apartment where neighbors had learned not to interfere. In what sounded like private business, on the morning of October 12th, 1944, a maid entered Georgette's West Hollywood apartment. She found the bathroom door open. The water was still running. Steam filled the room, and there, face down in the bathtub, was the body of a 20-year-old heiress. Scalding water pouring over her skin, a wad of gauze forced down her throat, bruises covering her body from a violent struggle that had echoed through thin walls while neighbors chose not to act. The fingerprints lifted from the scene were never matched to anyone. The servicemen who had seen her that night were cleared, and the killer disappeared, absorbed into the massive wartime population, where a man could murder, transfer bases, and vanish before detectives ever learned his name. An oil fortune bought Georgette Bauerdorf a glamorous address. It bought her independence. It bought her freedom rare for women of her era, but it could not buy her safety from whoever waited in the dark, invited in, unknowingly, by kindness. Before we understand how she died, we need to understand how she lived and how money built the illusion that nothing bad could ever touch her. Born into oil, raised inside an illusion of safety, Georgette Bauerdorf entered the world in 1924, cushioned by oil. Not Hollywood money, not celebrity money, but the older, quieter kind of wealth extracted from Oklahoma oil fields, money that came from land, drilling rights, pipelines, and boardrooms rather than cameras and applause. Her father, George Bauerdorf, was a petroleum executive involved in producing, refining, and distributing oil at a time when energy meant power. This placed the Bauerdorf family among America's industrial elite, the kind of families who didn't need to explain their money because it spoke for itself. They maintained impressive residences on both coasts. A New York home appropriate for their financial standing, and West Coast addresses convenient for business, travel, and discretion. Georgette's childhood unfolded smoothly between staffed houses, private automobiles, and an insulation so complete she would never need to work unless she chose to. This is important to understand because money didn't just protect her materially, it shaped how danger felt distant. When you grow up with drivers, maids, and adults handling problems before they reach you, the world teaches you a quiet lesson. Bad things happen to other people. Her education reinforced that belief. At the Westlake School for Girls, she was surrounded by daughters of the professional and financial elite, an institution known not just for academics, but for social polish, a place where connections mattered as much as grades, and where alumni included Shirley Temple and other figures orbiting Los Angeles's entertainment world. Westlake prepared young women to move confidently through elite spaces, to speak well, to trust the environments they were placed in, to assume that if a space looked refined, it was safe. But friends later described Georgette as someone who resisted the stereotype of the cold debutante. She was approachable, warm, slightly idealistic, the kind of young woman who talked to everyone in the room, not just those with acceptable pedigrees, who didn't measure people by their last names or bank accounts, who wanted to contribute something beyond her family's money. That impulse to step outside the bubble without shedding the assumptions that came with it would quietly shape everything that followed. Instead of living a life entirely arranged for her, Georgette chose movement. She took a part-time position at the Los Angeles Times, an unusual choice for an heiress. It wasn't about the paycheck. It was about seeing how the city worked. Newsrooms exposed her to real lives, real stories, and the machinery behind image making in a city obsessed with appearances. But even that job was secondary to what became central to her identity during the war. The Hollywood Canteen. Night after night, she volunteered, serving food, dancing with servicemen, listening to boys who were barely old enough to vote, talk about deployment, fear, and the possibility that they wouldn't come back. She used her own money to buy small luxuries for them, cigarettes, snacks, little comforts. To her, it felt like decency. To the soldiers, she was unforgettable. And to someone watching, she was predictable. By 1944, her parents had relocated to New York. Georgette stayed behind. They left her with a generous allowance, a car, and freedom, the kind of independence that money makes possible long before society thinks a woman should have it. She insisted on remaining in Los Angeles. She wanted acting lessons, screen tests, the social world revolving around studio lots, canteen dances, and the nightlife of the Sunset Strip. Her father's money made all of it possible, without asking permission, without accountability, and without anyone forcing her to think seriously about risk. And it was that independence, beautiful, rare, and intoxicating, that led her to choose the home, where her illusion of safety would finally collapse. The apartment that promised luxury, not protection. When Georgette chose where to live, she didn't choose recklessly. She chose beautifully. A 2-story, fully furnished duplex at El Palacio in West Hollywood, paid for with family money, but unmistakably her own. This wasn't a boarding house. It wasn't supervised. It wasn't a family compound. It was independence, with arches. Built in 1931 by developer William R. Hopman, El Palacio was designed to seduce Spanish Moorish architecture. Tiled stairways, wrought iron balconies, ornate arches framing shadowed courtyards, the kind of place that looked like security because it looked expensive. It sat just a short walk from the Sunset Strip, close enough to nightlife, close enough to opportunity, close enough to feel alive, and it attracted exactly the tenants you'd expect. Actors between contracts, junior writers, aspiring actresses, well-paid professionals, people who kept irregular hours, people who entertained late, people who valued discretion. What management offered was not protection, but silence. No armed guards, no formal doormen, no controlled access, just stairwells, courtyards, unlocked doors, and the unspoken understanding that what happened behind closed doors was nobody else's business. That atmosphere created a dangerous illusion because El Palacio didn't feel exposed. It felt private, and privacy is where predators thrive. At night, the building changed. The decorative arches became blind corners. The tiled staircases amplified footsteps, then swallowed them. The courtyards turned into pockets of darkness where someone could stand and wait without being seen. To Georgette, it felt glamorous. To someone studying it, it felt perfect. She drove her own car, came and went alone, kept late hours. Neighbors noticed, but didn't question. That mattered because someone understood something crucial. This building trained people not to interfere. And on the night she was killed, that understanding became lethal. On October 11th, 1944, her evening began exactly as it always did. A shift at the Hollywood Canteen, serving food, dancing with servicemen, smiling at boys who might be shipped overseas within days. She left shortly after 11:15 p.m. But she didn't go home. She told acquaintances she wasn't ready to end the night yet. She wanted to keep dancing. That decision extended her evening and extended her exposure. Her next stop was the Hollywood Palladium, one of the city's premier dance venues, a massive ballroom where wartime big bands played, for crowds of civilians and military personnel, a place where rank, class, and background dissolved into music. She danced until around 2 a.m., not with one man, with several. The same generosity she practiced at the canteen followed her off the clock. After leaving the Palladium, she encountered a hitchhiking army sergeant. She offered him a ride. During the drive, she mentioned she was in a hurry. She was expecting a late-night long-distance call from her boyfriend, an army officer stationed in Texas. She didn't want to miss him if he managed to call. The soldier, later identified as Gordon Ovid, said she dropped him near Sunset Boulevard. Then she turned toward West Hollywood, alone. He would be the last confirmed person to see her alive. What waited for her at El Palacio had not been improvised. It had been prepared. The automatic hallway light outside her apartment, the bulb that normally illuminated the corridor, when someone approached, had been deliberately unscrewed. The landing was dark, a blind ambush zone. When investigators later examined that bulb, they found fingerprints. They matched no one in Georgette's household, and no one they ever identified. Evidence that, in another era, might have solved everything. Reduced in 1944 to a silent question mark. Somewhere in the dark early morning hours, she returned home, and the violence began. It was loud enough that neighbors later remembered it. A woman's voice crying out, "Stop, stop, you're killing me." Words that echoed through thin walls, words that were dramatic, but not dramatic enough. Because in a building like El Palacio, people had learned not to intervene. Arguments were private. Lovers fought. Noise didn't mean danger. No one reached for a phone. By the time the screaming stopped, the illusion of safety had already done its work. The screams that were heard and ignored. When Georgette reached her building in the early hours of October 12th, nothing appeared out of place. No broken locks, no forced entry visible from the outside, no sign that the night waiting for her would end differently than the dozens before it. But the hallway outside her apartment was dark. The automatic light that usually flicked on when someone approached, the small, mundane detail meant to offer reassurance, had been deliberately disabled. The bulb unscrewed, a choice. Someone had stood there in advance, long enough to prepare, long enough to understand exactly where she would pause to unlock her door. What happened next did not unfold quietly. Investigators later determined the attack began almost immediately. After she entered her apartment, furniture was knocked over. Objects were displaced. Rooms showed signs of chaos, inconsistent with a surprise assault that ended quickly. This was not a silent crime. This was a fight. Georgette did not submit. She resisted violently, desperately. Bruises would later be found on her arms, legs, and torso. A map of struggle written across her body. At some point, the violence moved upstairs, into the bathroom, and that is when the neighbors heard her. A woman's voice, clear enough to remember decades later. "Stop, stop, you're killing me." Those words traveled through thin apartment walls and down tiled corridors. They were not whispers. They were not muffled. They were pleas. But in a building designed around discretion, no one intervened. No one knocked. No one called the police. No one broke the spell of privacy that El Palacio quietly enforced. People later explained it the same way. They assumed it was a lover's quarrel, a domestic argument, none of their business. That assumption mattered more than they ever knew, because this was not a private dispute. It was a woman being murdered. By the time the sounds stopped, whatever chance existed for interruption, for survival, was gone. Morning light revealed how carefully the crime had been staged to look like something else. A maid noticed Georgette's front door standing slightly ajar. That alone was strange. She was known for being meticulous. Inside, the sound of running water continued. Upstairs, endlessly. When the maid opened the bathroom door, she stepped into steam. Georgette lay face down in a half-filled bathtub. Scalding water poured over her body. She wore only the top half of her pajamas. The bottoms were missing. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for an accident, a fall, a slip, a tragic mistake. But that illusion collapsed almost immediately. The autopsy revealed the truth. There were no signs of drowning. Instead, the medical examiner found a wad of gauze, bandage-like material, forced deep into her throat. It blocked her airway. She died from asphyxiation. While she struggled, while someone held her down, the gauze itself raised new questions. It resembled material commonly found in military medical kits, not something most civilians kept in their homes. A small detail, but a chilling one. Her body told the rest of the story. A prolonged struggle, defensive wounds, clothing torn. Some sources reported evidence suggesting sexual assault, while others stopped short of definitive conclusions. What was clear was this: the killer had not planned on her, fighting back this fiercely. Downstairs, the apartment echoed that chaos. Furniture skewed, items overturned. But this was not a burglary. Cash remained, jewelry remained, valuables untouched. Whatever the original intent had been, theft was not the motive. In the parking area, investigators found gasoline siphoned from Georgette's car. Another small detail, one that fit uncomfortably with stories of her generosity, of helping soldiers short on fuel or money. Someone had known her habits. Someone had prepared, and yet the scene told a contradictory story. The approach was deliberate, the ambush calculated, but the violence was uncontrolled. A plan that unraveled the moment Georgette refused to submit quietly. And that chaos, full of evidence, noise, and witnesses who chose silence, would still not be enough to name a killer. A perfect crime for a wartime city. In the hours after Georgette Bauerdorf was found dead, investigators moved quickly. They had to. Because in 1944 Los Angeles, time was not neutral. It was the enemy. The city was flooded with transient men, soldiers on leave, war plant workers, sailors passing through, men whose names appeared briefly on rosters before disappearing again. If the killer was one of them, he was already slipping away. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began where the danger was most obvious: Georgette's social life. They compiled lists of servicemen she had danced with at the Hollywood Canteen, men she'd spoken to, men who had driven her home, men who might have mistaken kindness for intimacy. Every soldier who could be traced from her final night was located and questioned. The hitchhiking army sergeant she had given a ride to, the last confirmed person to see her alive, was tracked down. His timeline checked out. No physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. He was cleared. The men who danced with her at the canteen were cleared. So were those she'd encountered at the Palladium. Investigators pushed harder. They asked uncomfortable questions. Had she rejected anyone recently? Had a soldier become obsessive? Had politeness been misread as promise? Some accounts suggested Georgette had mentioned a man who lingered too long, a serviceman who showed up repeatedly, who interpreted her warmth as something personal, the kind of one-sided fixation that can turn dangerous when fantasy collapses. But suspicion was not evidence. And evidence in 1944 had sharp limits. Fingerprints were lifted from the disabled hallway light bulb from inside the apartment. But fingerprints meant nothing without a known suspect to compare them to. There was no national database, No instant matching. No way to check prints against millions of servicemen passing through California. Fibers were collected, but fiber analysis required a person, not a theory. And DNA. The one thing that might have rewritten this entire story did not exist as a forensic tool. The war itself worked against the case with brutal efficiency. If the killer was a soldier, he could be transferred to another base, shipped overseas, killed in combat, or simply reassigned. Before investigators ever learned his name, paper records were thin. Coordination between military and civilian authorities was limited, and as weeks turned into months, momentum faded. Physical evidence deteriorated. Some exhibits were discarded, according to mid-century police practices, that never imagined a future where cold cases could be reopened with new technology. What had once been a solvable puzzle became a historical ghost. By 1947, another murder would eclipse Georgette's in the public imagination. The Black Dahlia, more grotesque, more theatrical, better copy for newspapers and books. The oil heiress found dead in her bathtub became a footnote, occasionally mentioned, rarely remembered. Some true crime writers later speculated about connections between the two cases. Young women, Hollywood-adjacent lives, sexualized violence, possible staging. But speculation is not proof, and no evidentiary bridge has ever elevated those theories. Beyond conjecture, the reality is simpler and colder. Georgette Bauerdorf's killer was never identified, never charged, never named. He vanished into a wartime city, built perfectly for disappearance, erased by time, marked by silence. History does not remember every victim equally. Some deaths become legends. Others dissolve into archives, file numbers, yellowed photographs, a few lines in old newspapers. Georgette Bauerdorf belonged to the second category. In the years after her murder, the world moved on quickly. The war ended, soldiers came home, Hollywood reinvented itself. And 3 years later, another killing would seize the public imagination with far greater force. One more brutal, more theatrical, easier to sensationalize. Compared to that spectacle, Georgette's story seemed quiet. An heiress, a bathtub, no arrest. There were no trials, no villains in handcuffs, no courtroom drama to keep her name alive. So she faded, mentioned occasionally in retrospectives, footnotes, a tragic aside in books about wartime Los Angeles. The narrative that survived was shallow, a careless party girl, too trusting, too naive. That version was easier than confronting the truth, because the truth was uncomfortable. Georgette was not reckless. She was doing exactly what society encouraged women like her to do during the war: volunteer, uplift morale, treat soldiers kindly, open doors, smile, dance, listen. Her mistake was believing that kindness did not create risk, that wealth meant insulation, that living in a beautiful building meant protection. El Palacio still stands today. Its Spanish Moorish arches are photographed for their charm, its courtyards praised in architectural write-ups. Real estate listings emphasize history and elegance, but history is selective. What those descriptions rarely mention is that within those walls, a young woman screamed for help, and no one answered. To those who know the story, El Palacio is not just picturesque. It is a reminder that environments can train people into silence. That privacy can become complicity. That money can buy beauty, but not vigilance. Georgette's legacy is not a solved mystery. It is a question. How many times do we mistake comfort for safety? How often do we assume danger announces itself loudly, obviously, from the outside? Her life reframed her death. She was not a cautionary tale about recklessness. She was a lesson about assumptions, about how independence without protection becomes exposure, about how kindness, when unguarded, can teach the wrong person everything they need to know. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, Georgette Bauerdorf did not die because she was careless. She died because she believed the world was safer than it was, the last thing money could not buy. There was no dramatic ending to Georgette Bauerdorf's story. No courtroom, no verdict, no moment where justice arrived late but intact. Her killer was never named. And perhaps that is why her story unsettles, in a way others do not, because nothing interrupts it. It simply stops. A young woman born into oil wealth, raised inside comfort, given freedom that most women of her era never touched. She lived alone by choice, worked by choice, helped by instinct, and she died in a place that looked secure, surrounded by people who heard her voice and did nothing. Her father's money bought architecture. It bought location. It bought independence. What it could not buy was a neighbor who intervened, a locked corridor, a light bulb that stayed screwed in. In the end, Georgette did not fall victim to poverty or desperation or crime-ridden streets. She fell victim to assumptions. The assumption that strangers are safe. The assumption that beauty equals protection. The assumption that kindness carries no cost. Wartime Los Angeles was a city designed for disappearance. Men passed through without roots. Names were temporary, faces blurred together. And somewhere inside that chaos, one man learned enough about a generous young woman to know exactly how to reach her. When she was alone, that is what makes this story endure. Not the mystery of who killed her, but the clarity of how easily it happened. Because Georgette Bauerdorf did everything right according to the rules she was taught. And those rules failed her completely. So I want to ask you, had you ever heard of Georgette Bauerdorf before today? And more importantly, do you think her death was inevitable? In a world where kindness is mistaken for safety? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about wealth, illusion, and the price women quietly pay for independence, make sure you subscribe, because this is not an isolated tragedy. It is a pattern, and we're only just beginning to uncover it